So Borussia Dortmund are a good team. They're not one of these giants that we've taken a tanking off before.
I looked at the clock at 38 or 39 minutes and said, get to half-time. It was 3-1 at the time. We went in at half-time, 5-1 down.
Brendan Rodgers overestimates his own ability as a manager to get something in these big games. One week on from Borussia Dortmund, we are here to have it all out. Welcome to this week's episode of 20 Minute Tims. I'm your host Jamie and I'm joined by Melly.
Yes.
And Stephen.
Hello.
Yeah. It has been red hot, particularly on the Discord. And if you're like, well, what's the Discord? Where do you guys get all your arguments out between podcasts? Patreon.com/20minutetims is where you will find our Discord as a benefit for it. It is the best Celtic community on the internet. Check it out, patreon.com/20minutetims. You get extra podcasts, videos, writing, access to the Discord, and a front row seat to me and Stephen arguing with each other all week about who the bloody hell was to blame for the defeat at Dortmund. Martin Melly, we're all in agreement about one thing, we're in disagreement about a lot, but one thing we all agree on was that result just was unacceptable.
Yeah, a week is a long time in football, they say, and it was a long, long week, wasn't it? I felt, even after the Ross County game, that
You're still thinking about the bad news,
Yeah,
aren't
yeah.
you?
Yeah.
they always say, oh, you need a game straight away just to get it out your system. It's not out the system yet. So it's a tough one to take. I think the breaks come at the right time for Celtic. I'm glad they got the win going into that, but that one's going to take a while to heal.
The Ross County game following the Dortmund game, Stephen, it was like writing off your car, but then finding a fiver on an old pair of trousers.
yeah, something along those lines. Yeah, it is a week on from it. And normally what we would do is, if a week has passed a game, we would normally sort of sideline that and talk about what's most recent, lead with the headlines, as it were. But I think that game just doesn't go away. I don't think Celtic got off that easily, to be honest, after turning in a performance like that. I think in a lot of ways, the nature of that performance was so bad that it could end up defining the season and indeed defining what it is Celtic actually are in Europe again. Now, of course, we will have opportunities to restore a little bit of the reputational damage that has been suffered by going out there and getting absolute doing off a team like that. We've got other European games to come. Hopefully Celtic can put that somewhat right, but that it still sits there. It still sits there as a monument to the failure that was, we're going to have a crack at the Champions League this season. Now, it's not all gone. The positives are, such as they are, is that we don't need to play Borussia Dortmund again, like we would have had in years gone by.
I'll grant that.
Yep, so we've got that.
Only Atalanta and Aston Villa coming up.
Yeah, so I'm doing my best here. The other thing is that a one-off absolute demolition like that, because of the new format, might not be as ruinous as it might have been in previous years. We've got more opportunities to put it right, but that's assuming it is indeed a one-off absolute doing. So it's up to Celtic to put that right going forward, but there's no getting away from the fact that it happened.
So I think what would be helpful, right, is from the start if we establish some ground rules here, okay? One, no punching each other, no personal attacks, right? And third, I just want to clarify for the benefit of everyone in the room and you guys, for me, there are not 3 results of a football game, okay? There are probably 5 potential results from a football game. And that goes from absolutely battering a team, as a victory, to a normal victory, to a draw, to losing that game and getting absolutely battered yourself.
Right, yeah. Okay.
And I say that to say, out with the realms of losing a football match, a normal losing a football game, there is a worse defeat that can happen that could have more further far-reaching impacts, whether that's on fans or on the team or on the manager. There's defeats that stay with you and hurt a little bit longer than just your run-of-the-mill defeat. And I think why I was so annoyed about Dortmund is because that's where I class this. I class that in this 5th category that I've made up. We didn't just go to Dortmund and get beat. We went to Dortmund and kind of got embarrassed, to be honest.
Yeah.
And I think there's ramifications of that sort of thing that are, and indeed talking points and things worth discussion, that probably wouldn't have been. See if we'd sat here and we'd lost 3-1, but I think everybody would be like, look, they're one of the best teams in Europe, we lost 3-1 and that's the end of it. It was the nature of the defeat, it was the result, it was the manager's decisions and his comments after it that had me still sort of sitting here today, Melly, 1 week on, going, that still hurts, man.
Yeah.
But first of all, do you agree with the premise of what I'm saying, that this lies out with just a normal run-of-the-mill defeat?
Yes, it's a harrowing defeat, isn't it?
It might be the worst one. Sorry to jump in there, but see, rather unhelpfully this week, it has been lumped in with Brendan Rodgers' record in Europe, and with that comes Barcelona, PSG, whatever else you want to throw in there, and just Real Madrid. But this is the worst of the lot, in my opinion. I think that along those several years, we've played against some really good teams, but you're not get convincing me that Borussia Dortmund of today is as good as the Barcelona team with Messi, Neymar, and Suarez up front, and some of the best players of this generation. That's no. I might say some things tonight that seem on the surface hypocritical or direct contradictions. I might say things like Borussia Dortmund are a really good team, they're a brilliant team, and compared to Celtic they clearly are, but they're not one of the best teams in Europe. I know that a lot has been made of this. They were Champions League finalists last season, but that doesn't mean they're the second best team. For example, when Celtic won the treble a couple of seasons ago and played Cali Thistle in the final of the Scottish Cup, were they the second best team in the competition? No, of course not. But so the narrative going into that Champions League final that Borussia Dortmund played in was that they had absolutely no chance in the game. It was a complete mismatch and Real Madrid were going to wipe the floor with them. That wouldn't have been the case had they been going into a final against Bayern Munich, PSG, Man City, even Arsenal. They wouldn't have said there's absolutely no chance of this team winning. So Borussia Dortmund are a good team. They're not one of these giants that we've taken a tanking off before.
I think it is important to agree the context of where we see Borussia Dortmund. You know, they were fifth in Bundesliga last season, Martin Melli, and they lie seventh now. So as Stephen says, they're not one of these. They're not your PSGs, man. However many teams you want to class in that top bracket,
and I think Bayer Leverkusen as well. Bayer Leverkusen scooshed that league, swept everything aside in front of them, and Borussia Dortmund finished fifth. And we're saying, well, they are the second best team in Europe. It's just logically untrue.
So I think they're a second tier. Whatever you divide that, they're not one of the top 5 or 6 teams in Europe. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, they're one of the best teams in there, but not in that sort of top bracket, I think. But finishing fifth in the Bundesliga, shouldn't have been in it. Disregard everything we say. The game shouldn't be counted. It's a real tough one to take because it just seemed like we spoke about it on the big match build-up. The Celtic and Europe nonsense, all that was missing was a sending off, but they sort of doubled down on everything else, didn't they? So we could see everything that went wrong with Celtic and it was just a complete capitulation, and that's probably the most disappointing thing is I looked at the clock at 38 or 39 minutes and said, get to half-time. It was 3-1 at the time. And we went in at half-time, 5-1 down. That's difficult to take, isn't it? Because we just kept shooting ourselves in the foot time after time. I was like, stop the madness. There was more madness to come.
So one thing I've found difficult this week in the discourse of this game is, and you and I had a bit of back and forth to it, Stephen, on the Discord, was, and I've not found the best way to say it, but it's example pulling. So if you said, for talking's sake, you know, we should do X, someone will rummage to the annals of history and find a time when X didn't work. And then someone will find a time when X did work. And then there's a lot of back and forth. And I think the problem is, as you said, you know, Brendan Rodgers' record has been... We've dragged the Man City result from the first time up and said, well, look, Brendan Rodgers is hit for all these. Look at all these other examples of things we've found. And it's quite difficult to decide whether these examples actually thread to what we're talking about. Now, one argument would be, why did Celtic lose these heavy defeats under Brendan Rodgers? Is it because he has a very particular attitude towards European games that perhaps other managers don't? Does Brendan Rodgers overestimate his own ability? Because I think that's what people are really saying when they say, look at Brendan Rodgers and all these heavy defeats. I think what people are really saying, rather than use the examples, what they could just simply say is, Brendan Rodgers overestimates his own ability as a manager to get something in these big games. And I think we'll get to the players, but I think the manager, for me, I think there's a big element of that. I think Brendan Rodgers massively overestimated his ability as a coach to take Celtic into this game and get something from it. And I get that, one, by watching the game and watch us try and go toe-to-toe. I'm sure there were little tactical tweaks in the game that I didn't spot that football coaches and analysts and managers will spot. But then his second press conference after the game, I think he told it himself a little bit. He says, that's my philosophy. Would you? I'm not quoting him verbatim, and it's probably unfair not to, but he said something along the lines of, you know, you see teams come here, park the bus, and they end up losing 2 and 3-0 anyway. Would you rather we did that? And to me, I'm like, yes. I'm like, yeah, because it comes back to what I said at the beginning. Losing 2 or 3-0, and when he says change my philosophy, whatever way you play is your philosophy. If you decide you want to approach the game in a more defensive way and you only lose 3-0, that's still your philosophy.
No one's going to say that's a Brendan team, though. We're watching it, though.
That's
the
what
real
he
quiz. Yeah.
That's what he really wanted. So I think the first mistake the manager made was overestimating his ability, overestimating the team's ability as he coached them, and overestimating his philosophy, because there's no way he would have wanted to lose the game the manner he did. There's no way he would have wanted to lose the game the score he did. And the fact that after it he sort of said, well, that's the way I'm going to always play, and if I change it then I'm a bit of a fraud to myself. I don't know if I necessarily buy that. Do you think the manager carries blame here? How much of the blame?
Oh, well, certainly. I wouldn't like to... There are games in this...
And you can speak freely, by the way, because Brendan Rodgers doesn't care about the
No,
opinion of
no,
anyone
yeah,
who's
of
never
course not.
coached a game before.
I would certainly care if we were absolutely bumming it up here, though.
Of course we would. Dermot Desmond's never coached a game before, but every time £6 million a year lands in Brendan Rodgers' bank account, he's probably open to taking on a few ideas.
Yeah, so there's so much going on. It's very difficult to sort of channel your thoughts into a game like that, because we're all, even a week on, we're all still pretty sore about it. And this is the first time all three of us have spoken about it, apart from a wee bit when we were building up to the Ross County game, as Melly's already said. So we're kind of having a joke about it literally on Sunday morning as we're heading into another game. So it's quite hard to channel all the things that you feel about that game into a coherent point. So that might not be what comes out at times tonight. But when we're talking about Brendan Rodgers' record and even Celtic's record, there are things I'd be prepared to just chop off and disregard. So, for example, the Barcelona game where Celtic lost 7-1 all those years ago. One, it's a long time ago and the players are almost completely different, apart from James Forrest and Callum McGregor, maybe one or two. No, that would probably be it.
I don't even think Callum McGregor played that.
No, probably not, but he would have been around. So James Forrest is pretty much the only thing in common. He didn't start against Borussia Dortmund. So I'm kind of prepared to disregard that, not for that reason, but for the more compelling reason, in my opinion, is that the approach was completely different in that game.
Yes.
And we noted that at the time. We said it's very unfair to say that Brendan Rodgers just tries to win games in Europe by doing the exact same thing as he does in domestic football, because just as a quick reminder, the complaint, or not... The observation going into that game was that he set up with a flat back five, a four in midfield and one up front. I think it was it Christian Gamboa's debut? So he get thrown in at right back and expected to deal with one of the best teams in the world at the time, and failed that test, surprisingly. So that was nothing to do with, he doesn't change his approach. He literally did change his approach a lot. He changed his approach and the outcome was the same. So I think it's very easy to zoom out, look at the numbers on it, say 7-1, 7-0, 6-0, whatever it is, and think, well, this is all the same problem. It's a matter of approach. So I'd cut that one off. The Real Madrid one that Ange had in the Nou Camp there, the Bernabeu, I'm not bothered about that because it doesn't relate to Brendan Rodgers in any way. And quite honestly, when something like that with Borussia Dortmund comes along and shows you that how far we are off these teams, I think Real Madrid are 4 goals better than Celtic on most given days. 99 times out of 100 we play against Real Madrid in the Bernabeu. It might be a 4 goal margin. I don't think that's an embarrassment. So I want to disregard those. So Brendan Rodgers, is he guilty of maybe overestimating himself and underestimating European competition? I'd like to think not, but I think a number of factors play into that. Chiefly among them, the fact that maybe we just spend too much time in a bubble in Scotland, and maybe we think we are this all-conquering, amazing team, and it just doesn't translate into the very top level at all. And of course, there are a number of debates surrounding this subject about whether you need different personnel for Europe. How do you convince players to come here for 3 games a season where you're going to be needed? If you're going to be this destroyer of a defensive midfielder that we simply just don't need to play with for 99% of the games that we play.
Remember Walter Smith trying to convince us that Brahim Hemdani was a specialist in Europe but couldn't play in the Scottish Premier League because...
That's right.
No, not one single person listed remembers that, really.
What a pull that is.
Rain Man there.
So I think the term reality check is used a lot in football, and particularly when it comes to Celtic in Europe. That's something we use now annually, the annual reality check that we get. I think never has it been more literal than it is today. I think we have been shown what our reality is, and it's different to what we experience in Scotland, where we're the absolute big dogs. It's nothing new, but that was a very harsh and very severe reminder of just how far off the level of competition we face in Scotland. And I'm not being disrespectful to these teams. Again, that's a reality that we face. We're just a much bigger team than any of the rest of the teams that we play in Scotland. It just doesn't prepare us properly. You can do all the preparation you like. You can have teams scouted and all that, but if your experience is that you just wipe the floor with teams, it's very hard to say, right, press that button, we're defensive now, we're more compact, because you just simply haven't prepared for it. So I think a lot of things go into Celtic's approach that I would like to see different. Now, I think we will, just to sum up that sort of thing, I need to see changes going forward, because we can't fix what happened against Borussia Dortmund. I think we'll learn a lot against Atalanta. If we go out and do the exact same thing again, just go gung-ho and say, right, this is our philosophy, this is what we've trained for, and the same happens again, then that's a serious problem I think we've uncovered there. And Brendan Rodgers will probably have a lot of questions to answer when it comes to that, because the reason he's been brought back to the club in the first place is this potential illusion we've all created for ourselves about making a mark in Europe. That was the whole sell with Brendan Rodgers coming back to the club.
This is a mark.
Yeah, it certainly is a mark. Breaking records left and right. But I'm prepared to give him the benefit of the doubt and give him to Atalanta to see if I see anything different, to see if there's an adjustment made to that, or whether it's, well, no, that was just a bad night, we're going to keep on going. So a lot of words to say. Don't know if his approach is bad or not, but it's becoming more and more of an issue.
I don't know if he overestimated himself, maybe overestimated his players.
Yeah.
Brendan Rodgers, while we can look at the 7-1 defeat against Barcelona, you can look at the big losses he's had, he's also coached and managed in the Premier League and beaten teams of a better standard than Borussia Dortmund. So he's not this guy that just goes out and does this one thing and hopes for the best. He does adapt and change things. So he possibly overestimated his players' ability to play at this level. And I kind of look at that and go, right, I can maybe understand why. Celtic have won every game this season. The previous game in the Champions League, they went out and battered a Champions League team. They're in it, so it's a great result for Celtic. They played well. Going into this game, does he then sort of foresee this going wrong? He probably doesn't see it going this wrong, but for him, maybe the players, the fans, maybe it was a case of him going, do you know what, I want to see what we can do against this. Everybody's high in confidence. We could not have had a better start. Let's go in and see how we do here. And it went worse than could have been expected for me. I don't know if we just hit this game at the wrong time. Coming into it, everything was perfect. Celtic were playing well. We're going up against probably the best team we're going to play in these 8 games, possibly. And it was just seen as, we are going to keep doing what we're doing and see how we get on against the best we're going to go up against. And we took a tanking. And I'm looking at different things in the game, and I'm not going to pin it all on Brendan Rodgers, because there's absolutely no way he said go out and do that, because he said it and Callum McGregor said it. They did try to find a balance, but they were massively off balance.
Right,
now.
I'm just hearing a lot of excuses for the manager, to be honest, and I just think we're just not being critical enough. I think so. There's a few points that were picked up on there, and maybe we're covering a lot of ground as each of us speak. But I think overall, there's no excuse for Brendan Rodgers to think we're high in confidence, everything's going well, I'm going to try this out against Dortmund, because we all sat here last week and went, by the way, we've played nobody.
Yeah.
And Brendan Rodgers should be able to spot things on the park and spot the way that players are playing and think to himself, that's all right, but I've managed at a higher level. I've played with better players, and I know what it takes to get a result in these big games. And if I go 3-man midfield in a game against Dortmund where they've got such quality players, if they break on us, we're done, because they're straight through on the defence. And I think my problem is, when you're watching that game, and I keep going back to this thing, it's no run-of-the-mill defeat, that looked to me like, even me watching it as someone who doesn't know anything about tactics in relation to anyone working for Celtic, you're watching that game and going, this doesn't look right. There's just something wrong about the way this game is playing out that doesn't look right. And that's where it sort of gets me. You can make any excuse you want, but that just looked like an awful game of football. It looked like something functionally or structurally was wrong. And I think if the backup is well, everything was going well up until that point. It was working for me. But you know more than me. You know exactly what Dortmund are going to be like. You know how good Dortmund are. You know the Dortmund danger men. And you still went, aye, but we did it against Ross County. And I think that's where where I'm struggling with it, and it's not Brendan's job to come out and explain his approach, and he more or less says, look, he more or less said, look, I'm not explaining it, and that's the way I'm playing, and if you can like it or lump it, well, I think you can't then be pissed off, you can't be surprised when fans are watching it going, but we were absolutely run over the top of. We're watching things like Julian Brandt, just, even in the group chats, in the Discord, people like, are we not doing anything on Brandt? Because he just they had the run of the pitch, and you think to yourself, right, that's not an unsolvable problem.
It's the element of surprise. This is the least thing they'll expect, given our best player the run of the pitch.
It's not an unsolvable problem. And then one of you two said, well, it's no case of having a formation that you just switch. You just press the button. But again, that's management. That's football management. And if that's what it takes to win in Europe, like this thing where the domestic competition is pish, basically, but Europe is very, very difficult, isn't new. Gordon Strachan had the same problem. Martin O'Neill had the same problem. Brendan had it first time. He should have learned. And every Celtic manager since we've been watching football has had this problem where one week it's Wraith Rovers, next week it's Real Madrid. And that's always been the case of being a Celtic manager. So I can't have this thing where every season we go, the problem is at home we're crap. At home everyone's crap. And then Europe is a step up and you need to change for it, because that's the Celtic job. If you come in, Stephen, and say, you said this illusion that we created ourselves making a crack in Europe, Brendan's fostered it. He's used that. He's used those words, and there was no playing down before the game. There was no management of expectations. It's Brendan literally more or less saying, we've been brilliant for months. We were brilliant against Chelsea and Man City in pre-season. We've been brilliant so far. We smashed St Johnstone. We couldn't be better prepared for Europe. Splat.
Change it all and do something different.
There's nothing wrong with changing it all, because here I'm going to pull out of my drawer one of the many arguments I've seen this week. People will go to me, and you said it, so I don't feel you said it to me. You go, look what happened to Jim Goodwin. He changed formation and it went tits up for him. And what I would say to that is, it wasn't the formation that Jim Goodwin played that cost him his job. It was the fact that he tried something, it didn't work, and the team completely lost confidence in him. And that trying something and it not working and going horribly wrong, you could easily put that on Brendan Rodgers now. You tried something in Dortmund, it went horribly wrong for you. And now the players, every time they go into Europe, they're thinking to themselves, oh my God, he's not going to do this again, is he? And then they've lost the confidence.
Especially when the players were collectively and individually so brutally exposed by what went on, by the setup going in. I think there's two separate but connected issues here. One is the massive broad subject of Celtic in Europe and the things that often go on. And then there are problems that are specific to that game and what happened on the night.
I would happily delete everything that happened before it and just talk about that game.
Yeah. So in this game, I think two things can be true. I think one, the setup going in was exposed to be terminally, fatally flawed immediately. I'm talking 5 minutes in, and even before they get the penalty, there were a couple of chances before that. So immediately it was exposed. And then I think that...
Can I just pause you there? Do you believe there was... So you're saying this is fatally flawed. Do you believe then that there was nothing that you could do ahead of time, that it was that way you had to play and hope it worked?
Well, what do you mean? Sorry,
I'm not making my point very clear, but you're saying it was almost immediate for the kickoff that something was wrong here, right? My point to you would be, if it's immediate from the kickoff, then it's baked in. Then something you could game out in theory. You could look at that and go, oh wait, because there was no surprises in the Dortmund end. Presumably they've been playing the same way all season. I had to look at the formation; it's more or less the same all the time. So the exact Dortmund team turned up that Celtic presumably knew were going to turn up. We put out our shot, we played our hand, and within minutes it's wrong. And I think to myself, and that's one of the reasons I think managerial mistake.
I think so. I think that's what I'm getting at. I think the setup was fundamentally wrong. It's not something I was aware of going in. I was full of confidence in it, and anyone who caught our build up to that game will have caught the last thought I gave on that was that I'd be amazed if we get a real game. What was that?
I'd advise you just to stop making predictions for the rest of the season.
I'd be amazed if we took a real doing off a team like Borussia Dortmund, and I'd be very disappointed because these aren't the top level. But after 5 minutes, I'm like, this is over as a contest already. I'm already thinking about getting to half-time after maybe not 5 minutes. It was only a penalty, and then Celtic scored immediately after that, and then immediately went 2-1 down. But by the time it got to half an hour, that's it. It was completely done. And I think that once that is implemented, right, once that is the setup, I think it was very hard to recover from that. I'm not excusing Brendan Rodgers, but I don't think there's a huge amount that can be done until you get to half time and can possibly regroup. Melly spoke about just please just hold on and get to half time. But the goals are still raining in, and it's completely gone. It's 5-1. There are only so many things you can do by shouting and whistling from the touchlines that are going to fix the problems that admittedly you have probably created by going out there and exposing the players. It was one after the other, and I think to come up with a solution to that in mid-game would involve identifying just how many problems were going wrong on the night, and they were numerous, they were multiple. I watched back the first half because the second half is irrelevant, to be honest, in that game. I watched back the first half, and Neil Lennon in commentary is basically spending the entire half talking about the things you can't do at this level. You can't do that, you can't do that, you can't give the ball away in that position, you have to stop the crosses, and each one of them were different and valid at the time. So by the end of the half, Neil Lennon had, in commentary, just as an observer, trying to relay this information to the viewing public, had probably identified a dozen different problems that you cannot do at this level and were happening over and over again to Celtic. So there were a number of things that Celtic could have tried, but I genuinely think, and I don't like using this term about our team and about these players, but I genuinely think the players to an extent shat it after about 10 minutes and didn't know how to recover from it.
I would absolutely accept, again, there's probably a few bits of common ground between the three of us, but what I will accept was the argument that you make about by the time changes were possible, it was too late to change anything. Yeah. I completely agree with that. I'm not going to sit here and say, well, they could have done this mid-game, could have done that mid-game, because right, you see, you're 3-0 down after however many minutes, 5-1 at half-time, the game's cooked.
We love a terrible boxing analogy, but it's like watching a boxer on the end of a 12-punch combo, and just as he's already slumping to the ground, he gets hit in the temple once more, and the coach is shouting, head movement, movement, hit him back. So we're already slumping to the ground, and Brendan Rodgers is trying to change the outcome of what's happening to him.
Cooked. Mel, you were going to say something. You were going to disagree with me.
Not so much disagree, but
don't you dare.
I know.
Looking at the goals and how things break down, and boy oh boy did they break down. The Brandt thing was clear from the start, but that's a couple of minutes into a game. So if a manager just goes straight away, or change this after somebody's got in once or twice, you'd like to think that the players can figure it out and feel themselves into the game. The problem for Celtic, as it is in Europe, is they get punished straight away. For the first goal, Engels, who is at this level, and I mean against Borussia Dortmund, he is experienced, he knows what he's doing.
Experienced at probably getting pumped.
Well, but
plays for one of the worst teams in that league.
Yeah, but it doesn't mean he doesn't make a simple mistake. So I can't remember, is it Brandt who has the ball and he presses him from the wrong side, and Brandt turns and he's facing Celtic's goal? That's inexcusable at any level, never mind this level. And from that point on, Celtic get unlucky, Brandt possibly gets a bit lucky, and they get the penalty from there. So that's not an ideal start for Celtic. It probably did shake Celtic up a bit, get themselves back into the game, and then straight away Dortmund score a good goal. It was through the middle, it was a good pass through, and Ademi, it's a peach of a finish, but it does take a deflection as well. So from there, Celtic went into this game, and after 11 minutes, they're 2-1 down, having already given away a penalty. And Callum McGregor spoke about it. They didn't have that balance anymore. They tried to do different things. And from there, it was individual mistakes for every single goal after that. And that's why I don't know what Brendan Rodgers could have done from there to maybe stop Daizen Maeda cutting inside with the ball, to stop Daizen Maeda.
Well, that's why, sorry to interrupt, but before we just go too far down the road here, I want to address one of the things here. But obviously, I'm not arguing that Brendan Rodgers sitting at the side of with a PlayStation controller on him went, Brendan, you pressed pass when you should have pressed header on Daizen Maeda. I know that way, and we'll get to the players. But you said you're kind of, for me, Stephen can referee this point, I think you're making an assumption that everything was learned on the day. So you're like, 3 minutes in, Brandt's got the run of the midfield, it's too soon to change the game. I'm saying we should have knew that was going to happen before we started, and we should have tried to mitigate for it.
Yeah, but my point is that Julian Brandt is a very good player. Celtic will have been made aware of that, and Callum McGregor should have been there. He should have been tighter to him, but he wasn't. And you like to think you get away with that once, maybe twice, and then you do it. But from that point, Celtic were punished out with that, and they were found themselves 2-1 down. 2-1 down by sort of to a penalty and a decent second goal. But from there, my point is, Daizen Maeda cuts inside and the ball's taken off him. They score. So Borussia Dortmund didn't rip us apart. That is just the ball taken off him. Engels gives away a penalty. Borussia Dortmund didn't rip us apart. Yes, they were in our box, but it's a penalty. We've seen Alistair Johnson get given recently. It was two guys going for the ball. Engels touches the guy's foot. It's a penalty, right? That's not ideal, but what can we do about it? It's very unfortunate. Then the other goal as well is Daiza Maeda. A corner comes in and he's not strong enough going to get the ball. He's too lackadaisical on it. You're 2-1 down and then 3 individual mistakes. That's not a structural thing. We weren't ripped apart. We weren't taken apart. They weren't doing 20 passes and taking us apart. That wasn't structural. Those 3 goals, I think 2 of them were from set pieces, from corners where they got them, and one of them's from the ball coming in and Engels doing a bad thing. I just felt the game just spun away from Celtic and they lost control of it completely, and then people started making these individual mistakes that I don't think changing it and going 3 at the back or going 4-2-3-1 would have stopped any of that.
Well, I mean, you can't. The difficulty is when we're discussing and trying to analyse a game, when it's a case of individual errors, you can say, I don't know how going 4-2-3-1 would stop Daiza Maeda making an individual error. But I mean, you could just quite easily argue if he's going to make an individual error in the game, he's likely to make it no matter what the formation is. There's nothing really we can mitigate these individual errors if that's what we're attributing it to. But I wanted to start on the manager because he seemed quite forthright that he'd done the right thing. And I'm saying, like in his press, like I'm a Brendan Rodgers fan, but I think he deserves criticism when it's due. In his press conference, he didn't accept even an ounce of responsibility for it. He didn't say, I put my hand, maybe I did this, or maybe I had. There was no. How would even you politically would you phrase some of the responsibility on your own? I think he said, I take that one on, or I own it. But he said the same thing against Falkirk. But it was all about my player. That the other players were too good and my players weren't good enough. And I thought to myself, I don't know if that really washes. And I think you don't throw the baby out the bathwater, right? Just because we get absolutely battered against Dortmund and there was individual errors in the game, I'll accept that, and some sort of strokes of luck like deflections going in the back of the net. You don't necessarily rip up everything you've ever done. But this notion that, well, we can't have 2 formations or you can't rip up everything you've done. But any formation that's going to be successful in Europe or any way of playing, it's going to be successful at home anyway. If it's good enough to get results against these big teams, it's presumably it's good enough to get your results domestically as well. You don't have to have this, I don't know, luxurious, frivolous way of playing at home where everyone gets to do what they want and then throw that whole philosophy in the bin and play a completely different way in Europe that's going to win.
I disagree with that, but
why?
Because if Celtic were to go 3-4-3 in Scotland, you don't need 3 centre-halves in Scotland. So is that going to be why Celtic are successful?
See, when you say you don't need, what do you mean?
Well, you don't need 3 centre-halves sitting there when you're at Celtic, do you? Because usually you've got one guy up front that they just put a ball up to. So Celtic's 2 centre-halves can usually sit on the halfway line or just in front. If we had 3 centre-halves sitting there, it means we've got one less player going forward, which means it makes it easier for teams who are sitting on us to combat that. So the reason Celtic are so successful right now is because we're getting so much joy out of fullbacks. Alistair Johnson's having a great season, bar this game. He's getting goals, he's getting assists because he's getting forward. If you keep him in there in Scotland, you're going to take away a lot of Celtic's good play. That is why it is completely different how if you go into Europe and you go, do you know what, we're just going to sit in for games in Scotland. Fans will be apoplectic going, why are we sitting here with 3 centre-halves there? What good's this? We don't need that in Scotland.
But would you agree that if you found a formation that worked in Europe and it worked in Scotland, fans wouldn't necessarily complain as much? It doesn't have to be 3 at the back. But if you found another way of playing, you went, actually, we're not getting hammered in Europe. We're not getting our yearly hammering in Europe. But we're doing quite well in the Scottish League. I just think not knowing enough about tactics is difficult to have a conversation. Me back myself in this one, but I just think the notion that teams can't play, Stephen, 2 different styles. They can't augment their styles successfully.
Brendan Rodgers done that. He went 5-4-1. Ange Postecoglou went and played his way against Real Madrid and get beat. Brendan Rodgers now again went his way and get beat. So if he goes and tries and does something different like you want and gets beat, it's the same outcome. I think we would maybe just at a point where these teams where it's and look, the way other games where Celtic can get things out of and we will target them, but when we're up against these pot 1 teams, we've had one result in 14 years.
So what if it gets to the end of this tournament, Celtic play this way, we get smashed off Atlanta, smashed off Dortmund, smashed on Villa? Do you think it's still the right way to play?
Depends what the other results go. So if we get 4 wins at home and get beat 4 games
I'm not
away.
talking about get beat 4 games away. I'm talking about get smashed. If it's 7-1, 7-1, 7-1, would you still...
smashed on Villa there as well. Let's hope that's not the headlines
Yeah.
after the game.
Do you think it's... would you go, that's still the right way to play?
If we qualify, if we beat...
Because these are
Bruges.
rare results. Sorry to talk, but I just want to... Like, this is a rare result. Like, 6-goal winning margins in the Champions League are really, really rare. And Celtic, I looked it up, I think there's maybe 2 7-goal winning margins. One happened in the Bayern game the week before last. Next down, there's like 8 in the history of the Champions League, 6-goal winning margins. Celtic feature twice. So it's not like this is something that just happens. These pot 1 teams come in and they smash everyone. I think we think it's a lot more common because we see it every year and we saw it happen to Rangers. But in terms of like the whole tournament, these 6-goal winning margins are super rare. Football's a low-scoring game.
I don't know if... I'd like to look into it and see how many of them have been in the last 5 years, because it seems like every time Celtic have been in the Champions League in the last 10 years, which is maybe 5 times, that we've had one of these results. So I'm looking at it going, we're getting smashed. But if we go away to Aston Villa, Atalanta, Borussia Dortmund, and who's the other one?
Bruges? Is that no?
No, Zagreb.
Zagreb, so it is, yeah.
So, in fact, take those 3 games. So, if we get smashed off Villa, we get smashed off Atalanta, and we get smashed off Dortmund, but we take 3 wins and a draw, or 4 wins and a draw in the other games, we go through. So, it's going to be at a point where, what do we do against these teams? Because they're very good teams. They spend millions and millions of pounds. A 10, 11 million pound. Arne Engels to them is probably an 18-year-old prospect that they put in the reserves.
I suppose the discussion then, Stephen, is, do we care? Because what I'm saying is the whole premise of the talk here is I don't care. I'm not here to talk about whether or not you go through, you don't go through. I'm here to talk about how do we stop results like that happening again. And if the answer is, it is a perfectly reasonable argument to make and say, well, to be honest, I don't really care about losing 7-1 and 7-0 every couple of... If we lose 7-0 in all 3 of these more difficult ties but go through anyway, it doesn't bother me.
Aye,
but the problem you've got is, and I would bring it back to the Jim Goodwin thing, how much faith do the players don't like it. The players don't want to lose 7-1 or 7-0. That might have an impact on the way that they feel in Europe and approach these games.
Yeah, to pick up on the Arne Engels thing before we move on, you're right, because we think of that as a massive signing, right? But when it's sort of dropped into that level, dropped into the deep end, all that's really happened there is we've turned up with a midfielder, a good midfielder from one of the worst teams in that team's league. So that would be the equivalent of us, or we turn up to face Bruges, right? And we find out that Bruges have signed, I don't know, Blair Spittle or something like that. Do you think that would be like a massive, or Bratislava have got like Donnelly or something like that from Kilmarnock? Do you know what I mean? So that's the equivalent of what we've done there. So I don't think we should expect that to be the difference maker. On these massive results, I think that again becomes a broader Celtic in Europe problem versus the specifics on the night, because I think we would have to be, again, realistic in what you could turn a 7-1 defeat into realistically by changing a couple of things on the pitch without basically coming up with a completely different plan and a completely different team to all intents and purposes. I think it's not a choice you can make going in as well, because there aren't 2 buttons ahead of Brendan Rodgers in front of the game or before the game. One isn't marked, do my philosophy and lose 7-1. The other is do something different and maybe lose 3-0. Those aren't choices you can make going in. There's every chance that you could go into these teams or games against these teams fully prepared for every available outcome and still take an absolute tanking on the night depending on what happens. They're that much better than Celtic. So when we're talking about changing a 7-1 defeat, we're probably never going to change that into a 2-1 win by making tweaks in here. So the aim should always be to go into these games giving yourself the best chance of getting a result in it. What that means probably changing going forward, I'm not entirely sure. But the on the night, it completely ran away from Celtic. And those are 2 different things when we're talking about this as well. One is the approach going in, and 2 is what happened on the night. Unfortunately, it's very difficult to avoid looking at that glaring outcome called marked 7-1 when we're talking about these subjects. But the approach going in, it doesn't have to be radical. Could you experiment with a 4-2-3-1, which at home in domestic competition, that's not necessarily defensive, because that's maybe something that came up during the time where we thought, well, maybe quite useful to get a Watt into this team a wee bit more. He's gone now, obviously, but it was a discussion at the time. Could you bring a Watt in, put him alongside Callum McGregor? That's not necessarily defensive because that allows you to push your fullbacks up even further.
Engels might play that role.
Yeah. So you can get your fullbacks up even further. Callum McGregor can maybe branch off into that in a more attacking role. So adjusting what you're doing doesn't necessarily have to be outright defence parking the bus or outright gung-ho attack. There are many great areas in between. Personally, I don't think anything would have stopped Borussia Dortmund from just routing that game because, if I'm honest, I think they were too far ahead and too far gone after a very little time had passed in that game, talking about 12 minutes. Also, when we're talking about that, any adjustments made in-game is based on the assumption that they can't do the same. So any adjustments Celtic make to the game to try and stop that, Borussia Dortmund have better players than us.
That's
and
why
also,
I tried to bin that mid-game. I think the only useful discussion here is to talk about how the manager set up the manager's decisions. I think saying do X, Y, and Z, the manager can't get the players in at half-time and go, right, see, we're out there. I just scribbled a wee tactic down here and I thought we could try this, and then they all immediately take. That's never going to happen. My point here is that I just think that is out the abnormal. But the problem is when you're talking tactics and hypotheticals and, well, if you could do this, but that would mean this would happen, it's not really worth discussing. I just have to look at my worries before the game. The reason I've got feel so strongly about it is my worries before the game were, and they're luckily for me, I do a Celtic podcast and they're on the record, bud. Go look at them. Like the stuff I spoke about, we've played nobody yet. Don't do all it all just came to life, and I thought to myself, I do think we're at a place, Stephen, you talk about the weird world that Celtic inhabit, and I do think there is a huge element of that. I think fan expectation is up here because of how good we are at home and because we think we're all conquering. And then I think there's no way of stopping that bleed into, and it's not necessarily a bad thing, but I think that bleeds into the ethos of Celtic and the manager and the players. They think, right, God, we can have a crack here. I say that because there was no playing down of this tie. There was none of it. If you listen to Brendan Rodgers and Celtic and the players, they were just like, let's go, Dortmund, bring it on, basically.
Aye, and that's due to the way we've been playing and what we've been doing and the work we put in.
But on my point now is I think that game's a paradigm shift for me. I think see all your trophies and everything you've won, might as well go stick it in the bin. Because when you go play one of these good teams, whatever you've done in Scotland is not worth an awful lot in Dortmund.
So do you go and get a more pragmatic manager like
each
Neil?
of us have done that. For anyone
because
listening,
we all know it.
We're all wheeling out the big massive air quotes.
Neil Lennon, pragmatic manager that changes things in Europe.
Topped a Europa League group.
Europa.
Well, Lazio were in that group. They're a good team.
And how many times did they try and qualify for the Champions League while he was at Celtic in that second spell?
He got some absolute shonking results.
And he couldn't even get there anymore. So that's the level he was at. So if you're looking at it,
Brendan didn't go through qualifiers this season.
Because
so he just dropped in, right, carry on.
Because of the Rangers. It's all about the Rangers and the coefficient. Thanks, guys.
So Celtic are in a strange place where the best football I've watched over the last few years is Ange Postecoglou and Brendan Rodgers playing football at Celtic in Scotland that teams can't live with, they can't compete with. So do we go and get somebody to sacrifice that and maybe ship the odd trophy here and there?
I'm sorry, mate, but this is what I'm getting at, right? See, as soon as I suggest changing something in this Celtic team, you immediately leap to what you want to bin it all and get Steve Clark in.
No, but
that's not
the point. Your point is that Celtic are in this place where they can't do anything, and we're coming into this game and we've played nobody. It's going to be the same for another manager that comes in. They'll play nobody until they play somebody, and they'll get beat, and they'll get beaten badly.
So do you think there's nothing you can do at all? There's nothing Celtic can do.
But that's you jumping to a conclusion that I think there's nothing you can do. Like you're telling me, I say you go straight to Steve Clark.
So what do you want to do?
I think there's structural things that can be done. I think I mentioned it in the sort of transfer window that maybe that lack of an out-and-out number 6 might do for Celtic in the Champions League. It's the one position we sort of spoke about, didn't we, that we look a bit light, but when you look at the team as a whole, it was probably one of those things, we'll see how we get on this season and go from there. I think, yes, maybe going to a 4-2-3-1 maybe in the future might be better for Celtic, but we just don't have the players to do that right now, and we're in that difficult point where what we do in Scotland works. Going into Europe, we can't do that. Do we bring in certain players for 8 games in Europe to change things? maybe we bring in somebody, but right now, looking at Celtic, again, I'll go back to it. Even the 2 goals in the second half was Alistair Johnston passing the ball inside straight to a player who passed it to their striker and they scored. And the next goal was Baye giving the ball away just in the wing. They passed it and they try to take a shot. It rebounds back to somebody and goes in. Everything Celtic done wrong was punished. Everything they hit went in. If you look at the XG, if you want to be a virgin like that, it's not that it's not that far off when you see it. So everything they hit went in, but I just feel it was just one of those games for Celtic where everything went wrong. And if we had have sat in and done something different, I don't think you can legislate for the 5 goals after we went 2-1 down
Okay.
being individual mistakes. That from that individual mistakes within one pass, it was a goal.
I think also setting up as well. If had we decided to go more compact and sit in to be more defensive in a game like that, and again, this is more specific to what actually panned out in the game. I think sacrifices have to be made somewhere. You can't cover every single available permutation in the
Yes.
game.
Do you give up the wide areas?
Do you give up the wide areas and try and
I
congest the
accept that
centre of the
Dortmund are
pitch?
stronger in every single area of the pitch.
Yeah, it's just it might be that Borussia Dortmund are one of those teams that are just uniquely built to give Celtic serious problems, and that's how it looked on the night. And will hopefully the rest of the European campaign will be much better than that. But I watched the first half, and Neil Lennon was talking about it again in commentary. The amount of crosses that were coming in. So if you give up the wide areas and you try and congest the middle of the pitch, I think it's likely that they would have just bombarded the box with crosses, and Guirassy would have just eaten our centre halves absolutely alive all night. And then if you try and cover those areas, they're just going straight through the middle, and that's where all the goals are coming from. Adeyemi's just running straight through the middle,
Yeah.
and the comical. Some of it's not even Celtic's fault, deflecting off people's feet, and it breaks off Callum McGregor and just goes straight through. And Kasper Schmeichel made about 5 saves in the first half as well. So it was an absolute horror show in so many ways. The game, and I don't know if altering anything would have changed that game. But what we need to see going forward is hopefully proof that we can adapt to different surroundings and different challenges
That's
going
all I'm
forward.
saying.
Yeah.
I'm not saying change things and win the game, and I think all I'm saying is my opening statement: take it out of that last embarrassing bracket and bring it in a wee bit.
Yeah.
That's all I'm saying. A run-of-the-mill loss is fine, but I think when something like that happens, you need to talk about it. And I'm not saying rip up entirely what Celtic do, and there's no way to do it. And go, if we did this, they'd shell crosses. But if they do that, that's absolutely fine. But what I'm saying is that looks bad.
Oh yeah,
And it needs discussed.
why we're doing
and
this,
it
isn't
needs
it? A week on,
dissected.
yeah.
And if you think there's no criticism going to come after you get rattled 7-1 in the Champions League, the manner we did, and
after talking about how well prepared we are, Ronald,
Exactly.
and how well we've set up this season, how the board have done their job, the players have been excellent, the manager looks in a great, healthy and wealthy and prepared place for the Champions League.
and I
So
think Brendan Rodgers could have gone a long way by, the club comms could have gone a long way by saying, look, we're doing well in Scotland, but this is a different level of competition altogether. And I just wonder if, as I say, if maybe there's like a shift for me, what Rangers are to us, where we're never going to really, we might get once every so often win one of these games,
yeah.
but we kind of get absolutely, are we now maybe unable or incorrect to get absolutely fuming when we don't beat Borussia Dortmund, because we're just never going to be there, and you don't throw everything out. But I want to come to the players, because I think, Melly, you're right. From the manager's point of view, I think just changes the game. I thought we should have been more compact. I really thought we should have been more compact. I thought the distance between our central midfielders at times was mental, was crazy. Even when we're on the ball, and you're looking
we're
up,
running about in their half as well every time.
crazy. I thought, look, I'm not advocating for long ball, but one of the best things that we saw, and maybe there's a reason that we didn't do this, I don't think it was the manager's fault, I think it was the player's fault. These wee clip balls over the top from
out wide.
AJ out wide. We just didn't seem to do that in this game. And I thought to myself, right, we've abandoned that tactic, it didn't work. And we weren't compact and difficult to beat in midfield, and I thought that was suicidal. Everything else, you can't stick a foot and a half on Greg. You can't do an awful lot with the tools that you've got. But I just thought, with the team that took to the pitch, more compact. I think the players need to be. There's times when balls are on, but they're afraid to make them because they know they're going to get punished. I understand that. I really don't know how we get over that. And this is what I mean about this world that Celtic inhabit. Callum McGregor can pretty much do whatever he wants with the ball in Scottish midfield, right?
Yeah.
But now I think they've got PTSD from previous European results. Stephen, they know if I misplace this pass, it could be a goal. If I do something wrong here, and I don't know how you fix that for our players. I just think that psychologically these teams have got one over on us, and so they probably should, given how good they are. But I just think there's something going on with the players that you always said something last season or the season before last about Ange. You were like, sometimes it doesn't matter if there's a bad individual performance because the team have got a structure and they can rely on that. And I just wonder if that's maybe something that's lacking from these European adventures from Brendan, because it does seem like every individual mistake results in a goal, and that must really screw with the player's head. Like, as you say, you're 3-0 down in 10 minutes. You're probably afraid to give the ball away.
Yeah, and I think that obviously it's not going to be a surprise to turn up on a pitch, and the opponents aren't a surprise and the personnel aren't a surprise. You do your preparation going in, but I think there's probably a vast difference in sitting in a conference room, being shown video and saying, this guy Adeyemi's really fast, by the way, so do this to prepare for that, right? So, and then I think there's a vast difference between that and actually feeling it on the pitch and like getting that kind of terror from actually feeling it, actually witnessing it 5 feet away. When he picks up the ball, all of a sudden it's just a drop of weight and he's gone, he's away from you. I think Trusty did a decent job of keeping up with him on 1 or 2 occasions, but that becomes that's like one of those ones where, like, again, a tiring boxing analogy. I think it was Mike Tyson that says everyone's got a plan until you get punched in the face, and when you apply it to like fighting or grappling sports, start off with a black belt, punch him in the face once and he becomes a brown belt, and so on and so on and so on, right? So I think Celtic probably turned up full of confidence. He makes one run and all of a sudden, right, we're panicked. How do we deal with this? Right, Brendan Rodgers shouting instructions from the touchline. So I think the reality of going into this, as you said, a psychological blow that was dealt with straight away from that team and how good they are. I don't think we should expect to just be routinely drilled off these teams forever. But I think there will be a reality where Celtic just cannot hope to compete with these teams just now. To see these like pot 1 teams we would traditionally have drawn in a group, I think the reality is, and I think Brendan Rodgers said this after the game, the unfortunate thing is we don't really want to hear that, and I certainly don't want to be saying it either. He said that sometimes you just expect to lose games, or you can expect to lose games. And that's a bitter pill to swallow for a team that were so full of confidence and being told the reasons why we should be confident going in. So when we talk about the psychology of it, that's a complicated issue, because the confidence we gain from just swiping teams aside left and right in domestic competition just doesn't apply there.
I think that's the weird world. Like Lewis wrote a great column for us on 20 Minute Tims, patreon.com/20 Minute Tims. It's just a weird world we inhabit. And I think a lot of this is fan expectation, and as I said, I wouldn't have minded at all losing to Borussia Dortmund. It was the manner and the result of the defeat, but at the same time I am looking at these players going, I mean, what can you, this is why it sort of more comes to the manager for me. Like you're saying AJ misplaces a pass, was that because he maybe didn't have that many options? Is that is it, you're passing it, there was lots of passes inside. It seemed like Celtic for me were like pass the ball, get it taken off them, goal. And like, it's like you're saying, Stephen, use another hackneyed boxing analogy, but it's like they went out with their hands by their side and got rattled in the face 3 times, and the manager starting, someone shouting, put your hands up. You're like, no, I'm not Jim Goodwin. Like, I'm not Steve Clark. I'm going to take this in the face.
Celtic.
So it's that was, when I look at the players, I think to myself, I don't know what you guys could have done more. I know Neil Lennon advocated for going long in the pitch, and maybe Neil Lennon gives his players the freedom to work out what they want to do on the pitch, and Brendan Rodgers doesn't do that. I just don't see all of a sudden the players just changing completely and going long. I think that was on the manager. I was reminded though, do you remember, it must have been about 6 years ago, Gordon Strachan got absolutely ridiculed for making a comment around being Scottish and
the genetics. Yeah, that's right.
And now he got ridiculed for saying, there's a problem with Scottish genetics. And when you watch the likes of Callum McGregor and Greg Taylor up against the guys that you're like, no top European team has anybody that's 5, 7 and 8 stone playing for them, really.
Well, not in defence anyway. We've seen that. Sorry, Stephen. No. We've seen that sort of shift over the last couple of seasons where probably the two best defences in Europe right now are probably Arsenal and Man City. The whole back line, the left backs can play centre halves, the centre halves can play left back, they can play right back, they can play in holding midfield. These are sort of complete footballers. None of them are 5 foot, whatever Greg Taylor is. None of them are not built, none of them are top athletes, and Celtic are still trying to compete with this and find out where to go from this. Does that work in Scotland? It probably does, but finding a player who is of a good athletic build, who is pacey, who is good on the ball, all these things that they look for, it's not going to happen. There's always going to be players that have deficiencies for Celtic, but looking at the sort of profile of Celtic, we're sort of building towards it, but we're not quite there yet. Because we're in Brendan Rodgers' second season, it feels like we should maybe be a bit further on in this. But after that disastrous window we had last summer, it set us back so far that I think we're still catching up on this, and it'll.
But I would say to that again, manager, best I've ever been prepared. I was brilliant against Man City.
With what he's got.
I think I think a part of the problem here is, this is how I grade the problem, that because there's the actual result and there's a perception of the result. Manager, I think, could have done more to protect his team, right? I think PR wise, we all bought into how great Celtic were, and that, you know, made us all think we were going to get a lot better. Then slap, the reality check comes. Now, how do you fix it? Who knows? Like you say, it's a competition. You know, there's still 3 points at the end of the day. We might end up qualifying from the group, and it might be rosy. But I will say that if you're not happy, and I'm not talking to you, but if you're a listener or what, and you're like, well, look, there's no point in having a post-mortem now. Can we all at least agree if this happens at least one more time, we need to sit down and go?
Yeah, absolutely, it does. Yeah, because we're going to learn a lot from Atalanta, and I'm actually
I'm terrified about that game.
For a change, I'm actually glad we've got an international break in between these games, because I think if these were consecutive weeks, I'd be really worried about it. And when we're talking about the psychology and the worry about it, I think when you spoke about the athleticism deficit we face in these games all the time, I think that's another one of those probably panic-inducing realities that only become clear when you're actually on the pitch, because there were all of our deadliest weapons on that pitch, such as they are when you watch them in domestic football. Dyson is the cheat code, no one can deal with that, was dealt with, was well and truly dealt with on the pitch. And I watched one moment where he looked to break away, and he was at fault for at least a couple of the goals. I think he was quite poor on the night. I watched him try to do what he does domestically and just take it on the left and just bomb past someone. Emre Can just came over and nudged him off the ball, and he was flat out. And I thought, well, that's yet another one of those things we're talking about here, where how do you plan for that? Emre Can's strong, by the way. Just watch out for that. And then you go on the pitch and you actually feel it, and you think, how do we get around this? So I think there are key just athleticism deficits that Celtic just haven't addressed. And we've spoken about it a lot, about how the need for power in this team. But then you actually look at it, and Arne Engels is just getting ragdolled. Paulo Bernardo was like, he was wee-guyed left and right as well.
I think there was an element of us being, our physicality did lack in that game. And I don't mean that these players are no strong, because Engels is like 6 foot odd. Yeah. Bernardo's 6 foot odd. But even when we were tackling, it was just like, we weren't pressing as a unit. We weren't hard tackling. And so a lot of the time I'm like, right, there's a half-arsedness about this, but not in a way that they're lazy, in a way that they're unconfident in themselves. They don't want to commit too much, because they think, I'm probably not going to get that ball anyway. I don't want to commit, because if I commit at the wrong time, he's away. And I just think there's something that spooked the team. And
that's what I mean. What I said very early on, that I think that the players, I don't like saying it, but I think the players shat it on the night. Yeah, I think they did, and I think I'm trying to go into the reasons as to why I think that happened, and it is these realities that probably only became apparent on the pitch. It's not excusing them. I just think that going into the game, the confidence they'd built up just didn't apply to the reality of the situation.
And let me bring it back to Jim Goodwin, Melly. Would you disagree with the statement if I were to say maybe a change in formation would be welcomed by the players? Reason I would say that was because the players might be scarred for that. And then they see the team sheet coming out for Atlanta, they think, the manager's done it again? Because no player wants to go through that. And that could be a real chastening moment for the players. That could, make the players think, we might be good against St Johnstone, but we're absolute nobodies against these main teams, and he's sending us out to do this again. So I want to see differences. I just think I want to see, as I know it's such a catch, I want to see is more difficult to beat. By that I mean I want to see is more compact. I want to see is not have a situation where a player seemingly has the run of the pitch, a player that we all knew about, we all spoke about, you spoke about him, Celtic, and then it looks like we did nothing about it. There's almost little to nothing you can do about individual errors. Maybe you could look into the psychology as to why these happen. The players maybe need to be better prepared, because Dyes in that touch he took in the edge of the box, it ended up in the goal. I can't remember, it was the 5th, 6th or 7th goal, right? But he does that every single week probably, and doesn't get punished for it. I mean, he makes mistakes like that every week and probably doesn't get punished for it. But at this top level, the players need to now realise there's a stark reminder.
Yeah, I think that's what, when people say that same we all hate, we need to learn from this, and that is, for me, it's not, just learn to do it better. It's learn from it, and that when you get to your bread and butter, the league games, you don't take touches like that, because you know at some point down the line, further up the levels, you can get punished for it. Like, some of the stuff Celtic done there individually was unforgivable. I think we can be better structurally. I think we can do things better. I think one of the best weapons we've seen, like you said, was getting the ball out wide and going over them. I think Dortmund's fullbacks, Alex spoke about them, were there to be got at, and we know Maeda and Kuhn both have pace, so that is something that if you can get the ball in behind them, then you can exploit that. But we sort of passed the ball inside a lot, which meant you're going inside and that counts on you making a perfect pass and the guy receiving it having the perfect touch and being able to hold off a guy who's quicker, stronger than him and more technically better. So we did put ourselves under pressure in that. I think there can be sort of slight structural tweaks. I think we can get the ball and play to our strengths more, but as well, and I keep going back to it, and I do sound like a broken record, I can't really legislate for, right, okay, so if we went free at the back, if Alistair Johnston is in the exact same position, is having another centre-half to pass it inside going to stop him doing that? It was the right pass, it just wasn't executed well. A lot of the stuff, Maeda closed that down but didn't take the correct touch. Maeda got the ball and had a poor touch. It was all the execution of technical things that Celtic got wrong and were punished. So this is what we have to learn from. You cannot go into Scottish games, you cannot go into European games thinking, oh, do you know what, it's Scotland, I'll take that touch because I might get away with it. You need to learn from it. Go, no, my aspiration is to play at the Champions League, play at the highest level. To do that, I need to be better at doing this. And it is sort of basic things in there.
For me, Stephen, it's just a paradigm shift. And I think maybe I think if you were cracked fresh out of an egg and you started supporting Celtic today, you would never go into that game thinking there was any hope that you would take anything from it. You would just expect to do. If you're a new Celtic fan, you would expect them. Whereas we're of an era where we have seen the team challenge at this level before.
A long time ago now, innit?
A long time ago, but even, we were criticising them for not getting in the Champions League, but those European nights under Lennon where you beat Lazio, I mean, we were partying like it was a Champions League, so...
Aye, but for Lazio to be in that competition, they must have finished 5th, 6th, 7th in that league.
Yeah, well, Dortmund finished 5th last year, so I'm not going to bat back and forward the sort of hypotheticals, but I think a lot of it is expectations. So we had an expectation that wouldn't happen to Celtic, and you see it. So I think for me going forward, I'm just going to have to adjust my expectation until Celtic prove me wrong. And it's no defeatist, but I just we're going at a game against Atalanta, who, sometimes you get those like second or third tier European teams that are just dangerous.
Yes.
Yeah.
That's what I think. Atalanta, they're just a dangerous team that could really cause us a problem.
They're the only team that beat Leverkusen last year.
That's right.
Oh, come on. The one thing we don't want to happen.
Well, that's what I mean by, I think, I wouldn't chalk any of this up to just luck. I don't think it was one of those just, it was a bad day at the office thing. I think it was extraordinarily bad in a number of ways. It wasn't just one thing that went wrong. I think about a dozen things went wrong on the night, but that's what I meant by saying it just seems like Borussia Dortmund are almost specifically built to do Celtic in, and I think it was a number of things, and we've got a few of the reasons. There are even more. There are more reasons that we've probably not discussed. We could do housekeeping right now and say, just in case anyone thinks we're not going to get to them, Greg Taylor, appalling. Yes. Alistair Johnston, completely out of his depth. Callum McGregor, Bernardo, wee guy, as I said previously. Engels out of his depth in his his big bow as our record signing. Who else is there? Callum McGregor, I don't know if I said to him, terrible. Maeda, one of our sort of deadliest weapons, as it were, completely ineffective. Kuhn, the same. Just Kyogo, 5 touches or whatever it was.
Nobody gets any credit for that game. For me, I don't even. I mean, it's ridiculous to. No, in fact, nobody, not a single person comes out of that game with any credit, player or manager or John Kennedy.
I would say like Schmeichel made saves. He made good saves, possibly at fault for that rocket that flew into the top corner from a wild angle. Possibly at fault for that. But him, Trusty, and Scales were just dealing with fires after fires. Like,
I was on the very verge of saying maybe Schmeichel, but he did let 7 goals in the back of the net, and he pulled somebody down for a penalty. So
it's not a strong case, is it? If Casper was to come to us and say, "Look, I was really good," I'd be like, "Let's run back through that, shall we?"
Would you say that to his face?
No, absolutely not.
I think it was sort of summed up in Nicholas Kuhn's been our best player this season. Again, showed that at the weekend. There was a point where he went down the right, bearing down on their sort of goal, and he just sort of palms it back into their keeper's arms. If that's in Scotland, he buries that like he did at the weekend, and we see the sort of levels here. At the weekend, Ross County didn't pose Celtic too many problems, took the lead through a penalty, which was a penalty, but they weren't bombarding as they got themselves into a lead, and they made it difficult for Celtic. And when you're talking about Neil Lennon saying you can't do that and you can't do that, well, after the game, Chris Boyd said at that corner their defender should be closer to the post, and he just clears that. You can't do that at this level because you'll get punished. Ross County get punished. And for the second goal, they said the left back has done brilliant all game against Nicholas Kuhn. The one time he lets him in, he's in and he scores. This is what happens at these levels. It just goes from Celtic's level, Ross County's level, Celtic's level, and then Celtic and Dortmund. Celtic might have sat in 3-5-2 or whatever. Celtic were going to get punished off that team.
Yeah.
They were going to get punished no matter what. And that is the level we're at. What we can't let happen again is getting punished so much for those mistakes. Those mistakes cannot happen. And a lot of those goals are easily eradicated for me. And I think that's why I don't want to see a complete shift. We should still play the way we're playing. I think what we do, the short passing to get us out of situations, is good for us. We didn't play to our strengths, and boy, oh boy, did we show up our weaknesses there. The sloppy passing was unacceptable, and that's the big thing that has to change for me.
just before we go, hit like, hit subscribe, help us on that YouTube algorithm. I know I nearly got away with it. It wasn't for you, Melly, of all people.
Oh, can I give a final thought though? If this truly is a wrap up, right? Two things. One, all is not lost in this, right? The objective is still much the same. It was 3 points, and we expected that to be very, very difficult. Didn't expect it to be that difficult, however, right? We expected that to be one of the games where you think, right, we'll muddle our way through that and then concentrate on the games at home and against so-called lesser opposition, right? So still in much the position we would have expected at this point. 3 points at home, a defeat away. But I think all that said, as much as we can rescue this and still get the points we've sort of planned for in the first place, I think that's possible. I think we can still look forward to that. However, I do think, number two, we are okay. We're within our rights to have a bit of a even temporary existential crisis about the nature of how awful that was on the night, because it was unforgivably
Melly,
bad.
if we are here after Atalanta and Celtic get battered after Atalanta, will you say, you know what, Jamie, you were right. Things need to change.
Must remember to thank him.
Or you could stick by your guns, and it happens to Aston Villa. Will you be, you know what, Jamie? You were right, Jamie. I'm very, very sorry. Celtic need to find a way to change this.
You are the best.
You are the best. Yada, yada, yada.
Probably not, but that will depend on if Celtic have qualified or not, or have shown themselves up in the other game. What?
No, I'm not going to take 3 pumping as long as we qualify. We're here talking about the pumpings.
I'd take 3 pumpkins if we qualify.
Oh, yeah, well, that's the difference between me and you. And listen, and on that bombshell, last week, 20 Minute Tim's asked, are Celtic ready for Dortmund? And this week, we answered the question. Thank you very much for watching and listening. Patreon.com/20 Minute Tims if you want extra content from us. And we'll see you very soon.